Thanks all of you very much for being here. So let me turn it over to María Ibáñez for 25 minutes.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the invitation today. I would like to thank you for inviting us, and also to Victoria Frostpoint, because she organized, I'm sorry, I put it, okay, for organizing this seminar. The Center for Global Development has been central in promoting an important discussion on migration policies, as well as on the value of using evidence to design these policies. So we are thus honored to present our paper here today. Also, our gratitude goes to Ana María Maida, who will be providing comments to the paper. The paper, which is joint work with Jimena Romero and Andrea Velasquez, studies whether households rely on migration to compensate for the negative income shocks brought by extreme weather events. This paper is really work in progress, and it will benefit greatly from the discussion today. During the last decades, the frequency and lengths of extreme weather events has increased, and it has increased significantly. Due to climate change, these trends will likely intensify. In regions with rain-fed agriculture, which is a very large part of the world, the developing world, negative weather shocks have been shown to reduce crop yields, agricultural productivity, and income for rural households. The effects on the welfare of small agricultural producers who seldom have access to risk coping mechanisms can be extremely large, as some evidence shows. Incomplete markets for managing risk in developing countries, such as financial and insurance markets, for example, limit the ability of households to compensate for the negative income losses caused by weather shocks. So migration becomes an important coping strategy when these mechanisms are absent. And I'm really happy to have here Maria Ibáñez, because her paper has inspired us a lot on this topic. And this may affect a large group of people. The potential to have large costs is huge. So a paper by Lauder and his colleagues shows that in 2016, about 570 million farms existed in 167 countries. And most of these farms were family farms. And also most of these farms were small farms. Indeed, about 84% had under 2 hectares of size. Half of these farms are located in lower income countries, so it's thus very likely that many of these farms had limited access to risk coping mechanisms and lived in context of incomplete markets. So the purpose of this paper today is to explore whether rural households in context of incomplete markets rely on international migration to cope with the negative consequences of extreme weather events. And we're going to do it in El Salvador. There is already ample evidence that links weather shocks, negative weather shocks, and weather variability to migration. And our purpose is really to go a step further and understand whether agricultural losses and the ensuing adjustments of agricultural producers are mechanisms that partially drive this link. And as I say, we're going to study it in El Salvador. We do so by first identifying the effect of sharp temperature increases on agricultural production and the short-term adjustments that agricultural producers adopt in response to these shocks. We concentrate namely on the demand for agricultural workers, which is the center of our paper. Then we study whether the contraction of labor demand leads to international migration of farmers, but very especially so of agricultural workers. We then analyze what is the interaction between the ability of household to smooth consumption, the access to coping mechanisms, and migration. And we do it for 3 types of coping mechanisms. The first is migrant networks, through helping migrants to migrate, but also through providing remittances, asset ownership, and access to financial markets. So before going into the paper, I would like to discuss a bit the conceptual framework of the paper, because we believe it's very important and it provides the predictions for what we're going to study. How does temperature shocks push households to migrate? So temperature increases above certain thresholds causes drops in agricultural production and in agricultural productivity. And farmers really need to adjust input use to protect their income and their profitability. So in the short run, farmers usually have a really low margin of adjustment because many of the decisions on input use have already been done and are non-reversible. For example, if the planting season is over, Farmers may not be able to switch land to other users or cut back fertilizers. Therefore, farmers may cut back the input use, such as hire agricultural workers, and rely more on domestic labor. These adjustments are going to affect farmers and agricultural workers. And to compensate for the income fall, both groups rely on different coping mechanisms. So first, farmers may use labor markets to increase profitability, as we already mentioned, and I'm going to explain this a little bit further. But they may also recur to credits or to other risk coping mechanisms, such as selling their land, remittances, or migration. And agricultural workers may also rely on credits if they have access to financial markets, but they may also increase working hours, move to the non-agricultural sector to work on the non-agricultural sector, or migrate. So this is very important because when there is incomplete markets for managing risk, the negative income shock may transmit to the agricultural labor markets, as farmers use this market as an insurance mechanism. And this is going to drive down the wages of agricultural workers. And this driving in wages may be significant. If farmers manage risk through more effective mechanisms, such as credit markets or other type of mechanisms, agricultural markets will be insulated or partially insulated from the temperature shocks. Therefore, in regions with high migration levels, which is an effective mechanism to compensate for the income shock if other mechanisms are not available, we do not expect the temperature shock to transmit into these agricultural labor markets or to transmit in a lesser extent. Also, we expect that households that have access to a large array of risk coping mechanisms are less likely to migrate. And the results are going to support the predictions that we have in here. We contribute to three strands of the economic literature. And the first one is that our paper adds to the literature on migratory responses to weather shocks and to natural disasters. And this literature really finds that negative weather shocks causes internal or international migration. And this is mostly of middle income households. These papers really concentrate on the link between weather shocks and migrations, but rarely delve into the potential mechanisms driving this migration. So we contribute by identifying agricultural production as an important mechanism, and more importantly, so agricultural labor markets, which is, as I say, one of the focuses of our paper. Second, and this is also important, we provide a contribution on the effect of weather shocks on agricultural production on developing countries. And this is important because most of the literature concentrates on developed countries, where farmers have access to financial and insurance markets, where they have larger state support, and where they have more access to public goods and productive public goods. So extrapolating the result of developed countries to developing countries is really not valid. And what our paper shows is that incomplete markets for risk for agricultural producers pushes households to rely on migration to compensate for the income shock. The third strand of the literature is the literature on the cost of climate change and the adaptation strategies people will rely on. And here it's very important to note that we are just concentrating on the short-term responses, and we do not account for long-term adaptation strategies. However, we provide some evidence on some of the potential adaptation strategies that households will rely on in developing countries. And also, it highlights that addressing the negative impacts of climate change must be a shared global responsibility. And we believe that it's an important conclusion of our paper. As I mentioned before, we study the issue of Salvador, a country that has high international migration to the United States, is increasingly vulnerable to extreme weather events, and is highly dependent on rain-fed agriculture. Migration from El Salvador to the United States really started in the 1980s when the Civil War was going on. And this migration really creates very large migrant networks that is facilitating migration to the United States by reducing the cost of migration. So today, there are more or less 2.3 million Hispanics of Salvadorian origin in the US, and about 1/4 of the population in El Salvador, from El Salvador, lives abroad, and again, mainly in the United States. As I mentioned, there is an increasing frequency of weather shocks shocks, but the migration flows to El Salvador are driven by several dynamics. As the paper by Michael, the article by Michael Clemens shows in his very good article in Foreign Affairs, demographic changes, economic development, violence, and negative shocks largely explain these migration flows from the Northern Triangle. One of the countries is El Salvador. But weather is really becoming increasingly a potential driver. Agricultural production in El Salvador is mostly of subsistence farmers and is highly dependent on the rain cycle. Most are small farmers with land plot sizes as average about 1.2 hectares, and most do not have any access to irrigation. So data for recent Salvadorian migrants in the US show an increasing share of households of rural origin. And as I mentioned, El Salvador is highly vulnerable to weather shocks, and this vulnerability has increased during the last decades. The country has suffered more negative weather shocks of stronger intensity and with very damaging effects on agricultural production. So during the decade starting in 2010, the country faced 3 intense droughts. The first one is in 2012, where the reduction of coffee production, the main exporting crop in El Salvador, decreased by 70%. Then in 2014 and 2015, the country faced the most intense drought during that decade, and about 100,000 farmers faced losses. And when they were just recovering from that drought, a new drought hit in 2018. And this drought had caused sharp losses of staple crops such as corn and beans, and pushed the state to declare the state a red alert. So we're going to use 3 sources of data. The first one is household data, the encuesta a hogares de propósitos múltiples, from a period spanning from 2010 till 2018. This is a cross-sectional survey representative at the national and regional level. It's a yearly survey which surveys around 20,000 households that live in 226 municipalities in El Salvador. And we concentrate on samples of households with the head working in agriculture. However, we also do some exercises for the whole sample. This survey allows us to identify households that had migrants. We are not able to have surveys directly of migrants, but we know which households had a member that migrated within the survey year. So that's our main variable of interest. And the survey, importantly so, also has information on labor outcomes. So we know whether the individual was working last week, whether the weekly hours, the monthly salary, and the salary per week. Per hour, sorry. We also use agricultural data from the Encuesta Nacional Agropecuaria de Propósitos Múltiples. This is again a cross-sectional survey of agricultural producers in El Salvador. It is representative of the national and at the regional level. And again, this is a yearly survey in many municipalities in El Salvador. Here, we're going to use yield data on corn, and we are going to concentrate mainly on corn or only on corn because this is the main staple crop in El Salvador. We use productivity, total corn yield, the value of corn production, and the number of agricultural workers, households, and hired workers. We also use data of temperature from NASA, from the MODIS data of NASA. And here we have NASA has data on 1 kilometer grids for a 8-day average from 2010 till 2018. We use the average at the municipality level, and how we define a shock is the number of hot weeks per municipality during the agricultural season, which is Primera. And we define hot if the temperature is 2 standard deviations above the historical mean, and the historical mean we calculated from 2001 till 2006. We also control for a lot of other variables. We control for other climate variables, for excessive rain, drought. We include baseline characteristics at the municipality level, and we also include, of course, household data. We also control for crime. As I mentioned, this is an important mechanism that is also driving migration in El Salvador. And with this, I stop, and Andrea will start sharing the presentation and continue.
Okay. Let me know if you cannot see it. But now let's go to the empirical results. And our identification strategy is going to exploit both temporal and geographic variation in the temperature shocks observed in El Salvador between 2009 and 2018. And these maps give you a sense of the variation that we are going to exploit. So the first set of results that we want to show you are going to give support to the first predicted effect, that is whether these temperature shocks had an effect on agricultural production. In order to answer that question, we are going to estimate the following regression model using the agricultural survey that Ana Maria just described. So in this case, the outcome of interest is going to be the log of total production or production per hectare, and this is going to be measured for agricultural household I living in municipality J in year T, and this is going to be measured during the main harvest season. So this is the production during the main harvest season. Our main explanatory variable is going to be the temperature shock. That again is going to be the number of weeks with a temperature shock during the contemporaneous harvest season. We add all these controls that Ana Maria just explained, rich set of controls both at the household and municipality level, importantly controlling for other climatic variables and crime. We add municipality fixed effects to control for any time invariant unobserved heterogeneity at the municipality level, and year fixed effects that account for any national shock that could have affected agricultural production. Now, to account for differential trends at the municipality level, we are going to add interactions between socioeconomic variables measured at baseline, interacted with a linear time trend, and our standard errors are going to be double clustered by municipality and year. So the first set of results support the first prediction and are consistent with a wider literature looking at the effect on temperature shocks on agricultural production. And what you can see here with the purple bar is that agricultural production per hectare diminished by 5.4% with each additional week with a temperature shock. And that translates into a negative effect on total production that decreased by 2.8%. Now we want to test whether households are reacting to this shock by changing the demand of workers. And this is what we're going to do next. Here, importantly, the dependent variable, this is going to be the hyperbolic sign of these variables. It is very close to a log transformation. So what we see is that there is actually an adjustment to labor demand. All workers, the number of total workers is diminishing, but importantly, this is being driven by higher workers. So what we see here is a significant effect for higher workers, so that is diminishing. And although the coefficient for household workers is not significant, it's positive, what suggests that there is like this substitution. So we see that household workers are adjusting through labor markets. And we complement this analysis now by looking at individual labor outcomes. In order to do that, we are going to estimate a regression that is very similar to the one that I just explained. In this case, we are going to use the household survey, and these regressions are going to be estimated at the individual level for a sample of individuals between 15 and 65. Now, importantly, when I show you these results, I'm going to show you those results stratified for agriculture, for individuals living in agricultural households who are landowners that have access to land, either renting it or owning it, and individuals living in agricultural households that don't have access to land. And this is an important heterogeneity that we want to keep investigating, since, as you just saw, landowners are adjusting to the shock through changing domestic workers, hire workers with domestic workers. So now we want to explore how that adjustment is affecting directly individual labor outcomes. So what I'm showing you here is in column 1, the probability of working last week. In column 2, the effect on log of weekly hours for individuals who are in the labor force. And in panel A, I'm showing you the effect for individuals who are in agricultural households with access to land. And this is very consistent to the story that I was telling you before. We see that there is no effect on the probability of working, but there is a significant and positive effect on the weekly hours. So this is increasing weekly hours by 1%. That is consistent with this substitution. Now, in panel B, we see the effect for individuals in agricultural households that have no access to land. And once again, this result is consistent with the substitution that we were talking about. In this case, these workers, an additional week of a temperature, week with a temperature shock decreases the likelihood of working by 0.9 percentage points or 1.6% relative to the baseline mean. So overall, this first set of results shows that labor markets are acting as a transmission mechanism of these weather shocks on labor outcomes of agricultural workers. And Ana Maria was discussing before, now these agricultural workers need to adjust, need to react to this negative shock. And they can react by either moving to the non-agricultural sector or by migrating. And that is the hypothesis that now we want to explore. So now we want to test whether there is an effect of these temperature shocks on the decision to migrate internationally. Once again, the empirical model is very similar to the one that we discussed before. The only change here is that this model is going to be estimated at the household level, and the dependent variable is going to be the probability of having a member that have migrated within the survey year. Our results show that actually this is what is happening. There is a significant and important effect of temperature shocks on the probability of migration, and importantly, this is only seen for individuals in agricultural households. For these households, the probability of migration increases by 0.2 percentage points or 25% relative to the baseline mean. And when we look at the same model for individuals in non-agricultural households, we don't find any significant effect. And not only the effect is not significant, but the magnitude of the effect is very close to zero. So this overall is telling us that the effect that temperature shocks are having in agricultural production is translating in labor markets, and that is explaining part of the effect of international migration that we are observing in El Salvador. Finally, we would expect that this effect on labor markets and therefore on international migration is stronger for individuals that don't have access to risk coping mechanisms. One of the hypotheses that we are very interested in exploring is whether access to migrant networks and therefore to remittances might help to alleviate these negative shocks. So in order to estimate, to test this hypothesis empirically, what we are going to do is to calculate the median of the share of the migrant population, this is international migrants, at baseline. We're going to use 2007 as the baseline. And we are going to categorize municipalities above that median and below the median. Our hypothesis is that households that are below the median, like living in municipalities below the median, have lower access to these informal risk coping mechanisms and therefore need to rely the most on labor markets to cope with the negative effect of weather shocks. So this is what I'm going to show you now. And what you see here are three effects. So this is the effect for hired workers, log of weekly hours, and log of salary per hour. And you can see the effect for households living in municipalities that are below the median share of the migrant population. So they have lower access to those informal resources, and those that are above the median share. And as predicted, we see that the effect on labor markets is stronger in municipalities that have lower access to migrant networks and remittances. We do a very similar exercise now. Instead of using the share of the migrant population, using remittances to divide the municipalities, and the results are very robust to that. Now, what we expect is that if access to remittances are helping to diminish the effect of the shock on labor markets, then the effect on the likelihood of migration should also be lower in these places. And that is exactly what we find. We find that the impact on the likelihood of migration is lower in regions with higher share of migrants and remittances, which suggests that receiving remittances might help to alleviate the negative effect of the temperature shocks and increase the likelihood of staying in the place of origin. In addition to looking at access to remittances and migrant networks as a coping mechanism, we also look at other risk coping mechanisms. And what we find is that credit-constrained households and non-landowners are also more likely to migrate internationally. So now to conclude, in this paper, we use household data and agricultural producer data to look at the effect of temperature shocks on agricultural production and how this is a mechanism that explains international migration. Our first set of results find a significant and robust effect on total production and productivity. We see that agricultural producers are adjusting to this shock by cutting back labor demand of hired workers. So what this shows is that labor markets are an important transmission mechanism through which these weather shocks are affecting labor outcomes of agricultural workers that now need to react to that shock. And they react by either switching to the non-agricultural sector or migrating. And that is the part that we are focusing on this paper. What we find that effect that is very robust of temperature shocks on agricultural production is related to the effect that these shocks are having on migration. Now, two types of migration may emerge from this relationship. First, migration becomes a strategy to survive and to compensate for income losses that are caused by these negative shocks. And second, migration might be a way out of poverty in regions with untenable conditions, many of those caused by climate change and these weather shocks. So public policy and policies should aim to address both types of migration. First, policies should focus on preventing distress migration, should promote access to risk coping mechanisms, technical assistance, and productive public goods. But also policies should aim to facilitate migration when this is a pathway out of poverty. And some ideas could be access to financial markets or mechanisms to fund migration. In the paper, we have a set of robustness tests that give support to all the results that I showed you today. Because of lack of time, we cannot go through all of those, but I'm happy to go through some of those during the Q&A. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation and right on time. I want to go directly to Ana María Maida before opening it up to questions. So we could get 8 to 10 minutes from Ana María, if that's okay, Ana María Maida. Right now you're muted, Ana María.
Okay, I just shared my discussion. Please let me know if you cannot see it.
See it, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to discuss this paper. It is a very nice paper, very interesting. And actually, I just finished teaching a class on the economics of migration to 3 universities in Bogota, an online class. So I'm very interested in the topic of migration in the LAC region. As you know, Ana María, I also worked as an external advisor to IDB, so it was great to read this paper. Thank you very much also to Jimena and to Andrea. So what I'm going to do is first to go over what the paper does, why it is important to analyze the topic that the authors analyze, and what the paper finds. So this paper basically looks at the impact of weather, in particular temperature shocks, on the decision to migrate by both agricultural and non-agricultural workers in El Salvador. And differently from the rest of the literature, from most of the literature, what this paper does is to really go deep into the mechanisms through which this effect works. And the mechanism is the following. If there is a negative weather shock, which is a shock in temperature 2 standard deviations above the mean, then there is likely to be a reduction in agricultural production, and the type of production that the authors consider is corn, which in turn will imply a reduction in the demand for agricultural workers because labor productivity goes down. And actually what the authors will show is that there is no compensating effect through changes in prices. So then with this reduction in productivity, there will be a reduction in wages of agricultural workers who will then either look for other jobs or decide to migrate. So the authors really go through each of these steps in detail. They use many different data sets. So it's a paper which is really rich in results. And it is a paper that speaks to 2 main sub-literatures within the field of migration. First, all those papers that more and more recently analyze the impact of weather shocks and more broadly climate change on migration, and then papers that analyze the effect of push factors. So factors such as negative shocks in the countries of origin of migrants. So why is this topic important? Well, El Salvador has become one of the most important sources of migrants to the United States. The Pew Research Center reports that the number of immigrants in the United States from the Northern Triangle rose by 25% from 2007 to 2015, while the number of Mexican migrants leveled off and then declined. And, you know, when you watch the news in the United States, the migrants that you see arriving to the US-Mexico border, many of them are from El Salvador. And that type of migration, this type of migrants have very important political implications in the United States. So it is a very important group of migrants from a political point of view. And on top of that, from a political point of view, what is really important, I think, is the reason why these migrants come to the United States. This paper is looking at a reason, which is weather shock, which is very different from what a lot of news talks about, which is crime, violence. So I think this paper really is addressing an important issue because it is showing us that something that is related to the weather, so, you know, it's not only specific to El Salvador, is also related to what the world is doing overall, has an impact on the size of migration flows to the United States. So I will go back to this point, which I think is quite important. But first, let me go through some of the many results that the authors find. They find a positive impact of the temperature shock on the probability to migrate, but consistent with their hypothesized mechanism. This is only significant for agricultural households. They do find a negative impact on the quantity produced of corn and on the value of production of corn, which means that there is no compensating effect for prices of corn. They do find a negative impact on the number of workers, hired workers, not the agricultural workers who own the land. And they find that there is a zero impact on the probability of working for individuals who own the land, but for agricultural households without access to land, and for non-agricultural households, there is a negative impact on the probability of working. Now, the last set of results where you break down by remittances, by share of migrants, which I think is extremely important, and I will go back to it at the end of the discussion. There I got a little bit confused. I was looking at the tables, I think they are tables 7 and 8, and I think there is a typo. in terms of the title, because my impression from the table was that the effects are stronger for areas, localities where the share of migrants and the remittances are higher. But then the figure that you showed now is consistent with what you say in the description of the paper. So there, I didn't know which one was which. I think it's simply a typo in the table, in the title of the table. So my main suggestion is about the relationship between these two very important drivers of migration from El Salvador to the United States, which are weather, which is what you consider, and crime. You know, crime, corruption, violence. I think to give context to your paper, it would really be nice to give a sense of how important this type of migration related to weather is and relative to migration driven by violence and other negative income shocks. So it seems to me that you find that weather shocks don't have many spillovers on non-agricultural households and so on, I guess, urban areas. So can we identify, broadly speaking, migration driven by weather shocks with migration from rural areas and migration driven by violence with migration from urban areas? Does violence take place both in rural and urban areas? Is it possible that violence itself is caused by weather shocks? You mentioned one paper that looks at this channel, but then you don't go into the details of that. But you know, to the extent that weather shocks have an impact on labor markets, then I can see that they might also affect crime and violence and you know, have other repercussions. Now you do control for crime, and I think that's because you had in mind all these issues, but I'm not sure whether controlling for crime is the right strategy. Crime is clearly endogenous, and it could also be, as I said, a channel through which weather shocks have an impact on migration. But so more in general, I think it would be very interesting if you develop more this comparison, this part where you look at these two drivers in comparative terms. Especially because in the political discourse, it makes a huge difference whether migrants are coming because of weather shocks or because of country-specific violence. Because weather shock, as you say, is a global issue. It is everybody's responsibility. My other suggestion, as I was reading the paper, you already took care of, which was all these interaction between weather shocks, the fact that households might have migrants abroad, the fact that they might receive remittances, and you explained very well that the effect of migrants abroad and remittances could go either way. So you completely took care of it, and I really like that part. So that's it. I really enjoyed reading the paper, and I look forward to seeing the final version. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. I want to open it up to everybody. I can see all of you now. If you could use the raise hand function in Zoom, that would be terrific. And if it's logistically possible for you to turn your camera on so we can see you, that would be great. Although there have been moments of my life where I'm not willing to turn the camera on, and if you can't, we understand. I could just take a host prerogative to not just be selfish, but also break the ice by asking a couple of thoughts of my own. First is the outcome here is by definition partial household migration, no, because we're using an origin country based survey, and in the past I looked closely at Honduras's own EHPM and found the rates of partial household migration to be to be notably different from the rates of irregular overall migration that I was seeing from Honduras on the US arrival side. And that's not a critique of the paper. I wonder if it's possible that the effects of these shocks on whole household migration could be different, and whether to what degree we should interpret them as effects on migration in general, or as partial household migration. One thing that's in my mind is Sami Bazi's results from Indonesia, a very different context in which he found positive weather shocks to be correlated with positive migration, and other contextual factors could shape that interpretation. A second question was why these T-1 dynamics? But why not expect a contemporaneous effect? And you don't need to lag in this case for endogeneity concerns, since nobody's going to think that that migration caused the temperature shock. But instead of T or T-2, you chose T-1 for a reason. And I wonder if you explored other kinds of dynamics. The third was whether you link this huge shock that was very clear in those striking maps to climate change, but I wonder if we actually have evidence that shocks of this kind are increasingly common or intense in this region as climate change proceeds. And the final just thought is that there is the estimate in the paper that the impact on non-agricultural households is 0, but my interpretation of that is that there could be an effect on non-agricultural households, but it is diffuse. If it exists, it is diffuse across municipalities. For example, there's a negative weather shock for farms. Farms purchase less stuff like pots and pans. The guy who drives the truck to bring the pots and pans from the city to the rural area is less likely to have a job. But if he doesn't live in the municipality that experienced the shock, then his disemployment due to that overall negative economic effect of hurting the ag sector, which will ripple to other sectors, can't be detected by this method. So it is either non-existent or it is more diffuse than the municipality specific identification strategy that we have here, and it need not be 0. If I defer to other raised hands, or if you'd like to comment on anything you heard from me, or especially from Ana Maria Maida, please take a moment.
Thanks, Michael. We can start responding to your comments and Ana Maria's comments, which are great. Andrea, I'm going to answer first, and then I give you so you can answer also if you want. So the first one about crime, Ana Maria, thank you very much for the comments, and it would be great to have your presentation. And you touch upon a very important issue that we have discussed significantly, whether we should include migration, crime or not. Both Andrea and I worked on crime and migration. And at the beginning, the idea was to do something with crime and then do something with weather shocks. And we got so excited with weather that we decided just to control for crime. But you're right that this can be endogenous, and that it could be very interesting to compare both shocks, because as you say, the political implications of both type of shocks and migration caused by crime or by weather is different. So it could be fascinating to compare both type of shocks and see what happens. So we will do that. I'm sorry for the typo. We're going to correct that. And yes, we will. At the beginning, we started including the controls gradually to see what happened, and then we just included the control for crime, and then we didn't look to what you're suggesting. So that's very important. Michael, about partial household migration, which is a great comment, and we do a robustness check in the paper that should be called the robustness check, in Michael Clemens robustness check, because you have already provided at this comment, and that's very important. So what we do is that we look at how the trends of partial migration using only the household data, how are the trends year by year, and then we use the ACS survey in the US, and there we see if trends are similar. And what we find is that trends are indeed similar, but for 2015, when the drought was the higher. So what seems to be happening in 2015 is that indeed whole households migrated. And that's very important. So another important thing is how to really study migration using the migrants themselves, which is much more challenging, and that's, I think, is very important. With respect to the T-1 shock in migration, the survey, the household survey, we don't know, I mean, we know when the shock happened, which is in June and July, but the survey applies throughout the year. So when we just use the survey after June and July, the sample is too small. So that's why we're using the lag T-1. But we can, I mean, we have done also some contemporaneous effects to see what happens. And that was basically the main problem that we have. We don't have evidence whether these more intense shocks in Salvador is linked to climate change. So that's why we are very careful in the paper to talk about weather shocks and nothing that is related to climate change, because really we are looking into weather and not climate change. And that's very important. But you're right that we should try to look at whether the climate models that are there, whether there is a link and a correlation between this intensification of weather shocks in El Salvador. And yes, we are struggling with the non-agricultural households. We are struggling because we do believe that there should be an effect and we're not being able to capture it. And maybe it's because there is this diffusion effect that you mentioned. Unfortunately, the encuesta de multipropósitos doesn't ask about internal migration, which could be a mechanism for this diffusion. So we are not being able to look at internal migration as well. Andrea, I don't know if you want to add something else.
Sorry, I just want to add one thing with crime. One of the things that we do with crime too, since we think like it is important to control for it, particularly for migration, but we also are aware that it could be endogenous. So what we do for that particular model is that we lagged the homicide rates. So it's not the contemporaneous one, but it's the lagged one. And we do, like, we didn't have time to show everything here, but we also test the robustness of the results to controlling for like each of these sets, particular controls, particularly those that could be endogenous. Household characteristics, we were also concerned that could be endogenous. And the results are pretty robust to add in those controls or not, but definitely we need to be very, very clear about that. Another thing that I wanted to talk about that is it is, I'm sorry that I think all the comments in the chat, I'm like writing them up because you have really nice ideas and suggestions. One that is important is they're asking us if we can see heterogeneity by irrigated regions. And Jimena, please correct me if I say something wrong here, but we do control for that. But the thing is that the households that have access to irrigation are not enough. So we don't have enough heterogeneity to look at the effects stratified by it.
Yes, and we only use it in the case of agricultural productivity where we have the data available.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, Andrea, I don't mean to cut you off. I want to go to a question from the audience, but if you'd like to continue, go ahead.
No, I'm good.
Well, first, I just want to clarify, Ana María Ibáñez, the thing about non-agricultural households, that was not a critique of the paper. I mean, the key thing that theory predicts here is that there should be a differential effect between agriculture and non-agricultural, and you find that. But I don't think theory necessarily predicts that there's a zero effect on non-agricultural households. In fact, it could be the opposite. And your failure to find that could just be explained by the fact that the identification strategy is not designed to capture the ripple effects on other municipalities, which would be most of the ripple effects in the non-agricultural economy. It can't. So it's to me this explains the finding, and it's not a critique of the method. I see Susana Adamo, then Nancy Lee, and Thomas Ginn. And since we're coming pretty close to 4, we might have to close with those 3 questions. So first, Susana Adamo, if you could give a brief comment or question, that would be great.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. It was excellent. I have a question about internal migration, but Ana Maria already mentioned that the survey does do not cover that. So specifically, because probably part of the responses are there. I have a question about the climate data that you're using. First, you are using weather shocks in terms of temperature. I don't know if you also have information about water availability. Effects used to be different. Temperature and water. And the other, you mentioned that your base historical data for weather is 2001, 2006. Is that right? Thank you.
Maybe we could, thank you very much, Susana. Maybe we could go right to the other 2 questions and then let you conclude. If that's okay, then Nancy Lee.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for this really interesting set of research. I just put in the chat something on parametric insurance for farmers, which could be offered as either a subsidized government product or unsubsidized. And the thing about parametric insurance is that the data necessary to create it will in and of itself help to distinguish between areas where there is a permanent climate change related non-viability for corn or other agriculture versus other areas. So I'm just wondering if that could be a possible implication.
Thank you so much. And for the last question, if that's all right, then Thomas again, before I turn to the authors.
Thanks a lot, Michael, and thanks for the fantastic presentation, Ana Maria and Andrea. Quick questions on just how to interpret the results in terms of, have you tried any maybe non-linear specifications? I'm thinking if right now, I think it's in terms of per week effects, and it seems like if a region gets hit with 1 week kind of above 2 standard deviations, it might get hit with multiple kind of weeks in the year, and then the effects seem like they'd be very high and very strong. So try and think if I've gotten that interpretation correct or not. And then the other question is just, I think you said you control for droughts, but whether you also would expect kind of a similar mechanism of droughts being kind of the treatment and a similar result from droughts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It's 3:57, and I hope you don't mind going a couple of minutes over. If I know it would be great if you could address any or all of those questions that you'd like to.
Andrea, you want to give it a go, and Jimena, and then I give you the floor. Yeah. So, Susana, thanks for the question. Yes, we cannot study internal migration. We can only do it with census data, but this happens only each 10 years. So unfortunately, it's not as rich as this one. But we can try that. We do control for moisture, and we control for excessive rainfall and drought. But we decided to stick with temperature because it seems that it works better in other contexts. So that's why we're using temperature, and because we can compare it with other papers that have used temperature. But we are controlling for those. Nancy, yes, that's one of the implications of the paper. It would be very interesting to see whether providing insurance and providing risk-coping mechanisms to farmers, it's going really to reduce migration. That's something that needs to be discussed. Parametric insurance and insurance for small farmers, the problem that has been found so far is that the take-up rates are really low, and it's not really clear why is that so. So there's a challenge in implementing all these insurances, but there was a question in the chat that is very important about remittances, about using Venmo and all those type of things. So remittances and facilitating remittances can also be an important mechanism of insurance that we need to study a little bit more. Thomas, about the non-linear specification, you're right. And we try to do some other things. For example, we do just a dummy, whether the temperature was above 29 degrees, above 35 degrees. We also do harmful degree days, which is another way to measure that. That is less, it's more, it's non-linear. And we do find that our results are robust. Control for drugs, yes, the mechanisms, the results are very similar. And Michael, yes, I know that it's not a criticism, but that's something that we really, really want to understand well. And we've been going around and around, and we haven't been able really to understand well what's happening with non-agricultural households. And we would love to see that because non-agricultural households, we do believe that there is an effect because households migrate from the agricultural sector to the non-agricultural sector, and we really would like to continue looking into that.
I mean, it would take an input-output model or some kind of structural model of all of the economy of El Salvador to estimate the effect on the GDP and all of the employment in all of the sectors. But yeah, I don't think that you need to do that. To me, the very interesting thing was the large difference in the coefficients, not necessarily that you identified that there's a zero effect on everybody else. I wanted to give Ana María Maida a chance to say anything if you'd like to from all the discussion that you heard. It is now 10 p.m. for Ana María Maida, so mercifully we need to let her go. But if you have a word, Ana María, and if you don't, I'll just close.
No, I'm fine. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thanks all of you so much. One Ana María, the other Ana María, and Jimena and Andrea. It's been wonderful to have you, and all 55 of you came. It's been a real pleasure to host you, and come back again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Michael. It was great. Thank you, Ana María, very much for the comments.
Thank you.
Thank you for all the comments and all the comments in the chat that we couldn't address, but we saved them all. They are all very helpful. So thank you, Ana María, everyone that gave us comments, and Michael for inviting us. This was great.
Back soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.